Thanks for joining us. And today we're going to talk about Kriya Yoga, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and the Jhanas. So Patanjali's Yoga Sutras provide a description about the process of meditation, and it can be very helpful, especially for Kriya yogis, to be familiar with these 7 steps. And so in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, he talks about yama and niyama as being a prerequisite for developing in meditation and on the spiritual path. So yama and niyama are the moral do's and don'ts. So the idea that anyone who has some kind of moral compass that is grounded in best practices will be able to develop their virtue, and this virtue will support their spiritual development. As well, in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, in addition to the first 2 steps, yama and niyama, you also have asana, and asana is a stable posture for meditation. Really, one needs to be sitting in a position such that it is conducive to meditation and one can effortlessly move through the various states of meditation. Once one has established asana, one engages in pranayama, which is the form of intentional breathing. In the case of Kriya Yoga, we have Kriya Pranayama, this form of intentional breathing that brings us into a low idle state, into an internalized state, which is the next step, which is pratyahara. And pratyahara is really a process rather than a state. It is not a state of consciousness, it is a process of internalization. So what happens in Kriya Yoga from doing Kriya Pranayama is that we experience the pratyahara. We get the beginnings of the body receding from our awareness. It draws us within, which then leaves us to a state of dharana. This is really when the body starts to get really internalized and starts to disappear from our awareness. This dharana is often described as concentration on an internalized void. So body fading from awareness, being internally concentrated. And dharana means concentration. From there, as one's meditation unfolds, one can become more absorbed in those inner experiences. This has been described by Patanjali as dhyan, which is this inner absorption, which then naturally leads onto the 7th step, which is the superconscious awareness samadhi, so that one becomes one with one's inner experiences as it is normally described. And so these 5th through 7th steps, which is the pratyahara, the internalization, the dhyan, the absorption, and samadhi, superconscious awareness, are usually thought about in terms of states, but they're not really states, they're processes that one goes through. So pratyahara is the process of internalization. Dhyan is a process of absorption, and samadhi is a process of going beyond the body into an immaterial state. And so this process from pratyahara through samadhi really describes what one experiences in Kriya Yoga and is normally described as paravasta. Paravasta is the after effect poised state of Kriya, meaning that what happens to one's experience after one has engaged in Kriya Pranayama and associated practices. And so the challenge with Kriya Yoga is that there isn't really a very good description of what happens in Paravasta. Paravasta is a very wide-ranging set of experiences that one has. And in particular, how does one know what state one is in, and how does one know if one is actually progressing in their practice? So how do we know what's happening in Paravasta? Fortunately, the stages of Paravasta have been very well mapped out by the Buddha, and the Buddha has described these in terms of the jhanas, the states of absorption, and as well to describe particular characteristics of these jhanas, of these states of absorption, that allow us to know where we are in the progression from internalization all the way to the highest levels of meditation, to the highest levels of awareness. Now, to get into meditation at all, it is normally not understood that one needs to go through a process of letting go of the 5 hindrances. And these hindrances are really impurities in the mind that prevent one from going into a meditative state. And so these hindrances are sensual craving, aversion, restlessness and remorse, sloth and torpor, and doubt. And if one has attachment related to any of these 5 hindrances, what happens is distracting thoughts come up that prevent one from going into meditation. One is preoccupied with those thoughts rooted in the hindrances. What can often happen when one is doing Kriya Yoga is that one will engage in Kriya Pranayama, etc., and then be sitting in Paravasta, and then these thoughts that are coming up that prevent one from going deeper into meditation, and often people will flounder in it. They may have thoughts of restlessness, they may have thoughts of sensual craving, they may not really understand what is happening, what state they're in. This is doubt. They may be drifting off into sloth and torpor, so they lose their focus. They may be fighting internally with sensations that they do not like to push those away. This is aversion. And so when one learns how to recognize these hindrances as they arise in meditation, and then to let them go, what happens is spontaneous joy arises in one's meditation, which is called pamoja, and this spontaneously leads into jhana, into states of absorption. And so this is a crucial thing to know for any meditator, is that if any of these hindrances arise, one needs to recognize them as impersonal, impermanent, and unsatisfying, and then to abandon those hindrances. And if one engages in that process of recognizing and abandoning the hindrances while one is in paravasta, one will spontaneously start to move through the jhanas. And so these jhanas, these states of absorption, are very well described in the Buddhist suttas, which are the discourses that were written down by Buddhist disciples. And so when we look and understand the characteristics of these jhanas, we can know what to look for in our meditation and to see how we're progressing and to better direct our efforts so that we can go into deep meditation. From Majjhima Nikaya 29, the middle-length discourses of the Buddha, it states, "Having thus abandoned these 5 hindrances, imperfections of the mind that weaken wisdom, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, he enters upon and abides in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion." And so this state of the first jhana arises as one lets go of the hindrances. So one can do this when one is in paravasta. And so this rapture and pleasure born of seclusion are really the feelings of the parasympathetic nervous system engaging in the body. So you have the piti, which is the rapturous sensations in the body, which Kriya yogis often experience. And also you have the sukha, which is this spontaneous joy that starts to emerge. So the presence of this piti and sukha helps one know that one is in the first jhana. As well, there's the intentional thinking mind, what is called applied and sustained thought, meaning that one can still be directing one's meditation with some sense of intentionality. So when that intentionality is there, the applied and sustained thought, and the piti and sukha, the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, one is in the first jhana. Now, one can try to hold that jhana, to try and stay in that state, and one can remain in that, but that won't allow one to progress. What one needs to do is to recognize that this state is not permanent, that is not ultimately satisfying, and that it is actually impersonal. And when one recognizes that, one starts to transition into the second jhana. Again, with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, a bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the second jhana, which has self-confidence and singleness of mind, without applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of concentration. So the key aspect of getting into the second jhana is really letting go of that applied and sustained thought, that intentional thinking mind. So if one is able to abandon that, what happens is that one's mind becomes quiet and one's attention becomes collected, sometimes talked about in terms of concentration. But the concentration is not pinpoint concentration. The concentration is a collected concentration of mind around the state of consciousness that one is experiencing. And one experiences this unification of mind, what is called ekaggata. And those are the characteristics of the second jhana. Again, with the fading away as well of rapture, a bhikkhu abides in equanimity, and mindful and fully aware, still feeling pleasure with the body, he enters upon and abides in the third jhana, on which the noble ones announce, he has a pleasant abiding who has equanimity and is mindful. So the third jhana is really characterized by the feelings of piti, those rapturous feelings of the body starting to fade away. And this is because one is going into a deeper meditative state. There is an equanimity and there's a joy in this state. Often people can feel as if the energy or the feelings, the sensations in paravasta, start to become centered around the heart. This is a very enjoyable state of being. And if one is able to recognize the impermanence of this state, to recognize the impersonality of the state, and to recognize the unsatisfying nature of the state, one will start to go into the fourth jhana. Again, with the abandoning of pleasure and pain, and with the previous disappearance of joy and grief, a bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the fourth jhana, which has neither pain nor pleasure, and purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. So what happens in this fourth jhana is that the body starts to disappear. This is normally what we talk about in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras in terms of dharana, this internalized concentration. But what also happens if one is abandoning the attachment to these states is that one's mindfulness becomes very keen. What happens is one is able to recognize how the mind's attention moves from one thing to the other and to be very clear. It's a very clear state. And it is a purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. So equanimity is when the mind is very stable. It is not thrown off kilter by internal phenomena. And so this combination of mindfulness due to equanimity and the disappearance of the body as it starts to fade away is the fourth jhana. Majjhima Nikaya 111. Again, bhikkhus, with the complete surmounting of perceptions of form, with the disappearance of perceptions of sensory impact, with non-attention to perceptions of diversity, aware that space is infinite, one enters upon and abides in the base of infinite space. So this is really when one has let go in the fourth jhana, and one starts to abandon sensations of diversity, and one starts to lose one's sense of separation from the greater whole, if you will. This is what leads to the perception of infinite space. And so this is the fifth jhana, what is sometimes described as the first state of samadhi that people experience, the feeling of infinite space, what some people have described as Christ consciousness. And so this is a very lofty, exalted state. But if one can again recognize the impermanence of this state, to see that it does not provide lasting satisfaction, and to recognize the impersonality of the state, one will start to move into the next higher state, which is the sixth jhana. Again, bhikkhus, by completely surmounting the base of infinite space, aware that consciousness is infinite, one enters upon and abides in the base of infinite consciousness. And really what happens is the perception of infinite space is filled with a perception of infinite consciousness. And the consciousness has a very blissful quality to it. And some have expressed this in terms of the experience of Satchitananda, ever-existing, ever-conscious, ever-new bliss. And so in this sixth jhana state, the perception of infinite consciousness, if one is aware of the impermanent nature of this state, is that those consciousnesses are arising and disappearing constantly. And one is able to see that with clarity, to let go, to abandon it, to recognize that it does not provide lasting satisfaction and that this state is impersonal. One will be led into the next state, which is the seventh jhana. Again, bhikkhus, by completely surmounting the base of infinite consciousness, aware that there is nothing, one enters upon and abides in the base of nothingness. And so this happens when one recognizes that the infinite consciousness is not permanent and lets go, abandons attachment to that. And one perceives that beyond the infinite consciousness is nothingness. And as well, this perception of nothingness is conjoined with equanimity. And so one has an even-minded perception of nothingness. But if one is able to recognize again the impermanent nature of this nothingness, to realize that it does not provide lasting satisfaction, and to see that it is really impersonal, and to abandon that, one is led into the next higher state, which is the eighth jhana. Again, bhikkhus, by completely surmounting the base of nothingness, one enters upon and abides in the base of neither perception nor non-perception. And so this state of the eighth jhana is a very curious one indeed, and has many aspects to it. One, which is the cradle of intuition. So the mind in this state of neither perception nor non-perception is exceptionally clear. The intuition is in full operation, and one can utilize this intuition to know all sorts of things. And really an understanding of what occurs in this state, the fine perceptions that arise in the state will give one a very clear picture of one's nature. And it also gives one an opportunity to let go of a variety of patterns that govern one's karma. So it's a very effective state in which to do a lot of spiritual work and to make lots of spiritual transformation. And so certain elements of this state have been exalted in various writings. So some people have referred to this as nirbija samadhi, the seedless samadhi, the state of the animita samadhi, where one's mind is completely impervious. But then again, if one is able to recognize that this is an impermanent state, that it does not provide lasting satisfaction, and that is actually impersonal, one abandons attachment to it. And that by abandoning this state, one can move beyond. Again, bhikkhus, by completely surmounting the base of neither perception nor non-perception, one enters upon and abides in the cessation of perception and feeling. And this experience of the cessation of perception, feeling, and consciousness really is the end of the road for meditation. It is when one contacts the unconditioned absolute nirvana and experiences a cessation of feeling, perception, and consciousness. And from that, what can happen is the mind stops. And as one returns from contact with the nibbana dhatu, the nibbana element, one has all sorts of insights as one's mind reboots. And one starts to see very clearly the links of dependent origination, how one comes to be in this world. and the variety of karmic factors that govern one's experience. So familiarity with the jhanas provides Kriya yogis a very clear picture of the characteristics that are inherent within each of these states. And if one is able to recognize these characteristics and learns how to abandon attachment to those particular states, one can move effortlessly through the jhanas to the highest levels of perception and beyond. So if you have any questions about this video, feel free to send me an email at info@modernkriya.com. Also check our website at modernkriya.com and our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.